Delighted to welcome up Gavin Ortlund for you this morning. Come on up, Gavin.
Thank you, my brother. Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all awake out there. I've been traveling now for 9 days, and I'm still on California time. It feels like, I don't know, some trips you just snap through it, other times you don't. But I'm really excited to dive into this. So even though it's early, let me just invite you to open up your heart and mind with me, and this will be somewhat conversational. I'll be pausing at points, maybe to even ask you a thought, your reaction to something, but I'm so excited to dive in. Let me just say two things at the beginning of, number one, just what an honor it is to be here. There's so many great things happening here at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Just being here in a short window of time gives you that sense of, especially in apologetics, it feels like it's this hot zone where so many great things are happening. So I'm really honored to be here. I also wanted to say how much I appreciated Dr. J.P. Moreland's talk last night. I found myself leaving, honestly, just inspired to pray for miracles. And several of the things that he shared resonated in a particular way with me. So I'm hoping my comments will extend further in the same direction, sort of devotionally, as we think together here. One of the great passions of my life is to be a friend and a help to skeptics and to Christians struggling with doubt. One of the reasons for that is I know what that feels like. Some of you may know what that feels like. There's a unique kind of anguish and darkness that comes when you are going through a season of doubt or pain related to questions about your faith. G. Campbell Morgan was a pastor. He was raised in a godly Christian home, but he went through a season of doubt in college, and he said, in the worst of it, there came a moment when I was sure of nothing. I wonder if you've ever been through something like that, or you know someone who's been through something like that feeling like you're turned upside down, you're trying to figure out how to turn right back up. That is really tough. And that's one reason the Bible says, have mercy on those who doubt. They need our mercy. Now, one of the things we think is, well, that happens to weak Christians, but godly Christians don't go through that level of pain and disillusionment, right? You think that's true? C.S. Lewis was toward the end of his career when he wrote a book, A Grief Observed. He was so raw in speaking about his sense and emotions of God's hiddenness in the process of his grief that people did not believe he was the real author because it was originally published in a pseudonym. You can see the end of the passage I'm about to read on the next slide. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you're tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights on in the windows. Whew, real encouraging note to begin with this morning. Just to pick us all up, I know that I'm unusual, but I find it comforting to read that kind of raw honesty, just as I find it comforting in the Psalms when we find the same. But I also recognize not everyone else finds that comforting. Some people find that really jarring, so I see you if that's you out there. But the reason I want to mention this at the beginning is because I believe that in our day there's a whole movement of people who are struggling to some extent with these kinds of emotions and feelings. And this word deconstruction has become a buzzword these days. It's just coming from another conference where we were talking all about the deconstruction movement and what does that mean. And it means so many different things, but at least one of the things that it means is people who are deconverting, people who are walking away from their Christian faith altogether. And as I've tried to make good on my ambition to be a friend to those who are struggling with doubts, one of the things I've experienced is how many people have these kinds of emotions along the way. It can be incredibly tumultuous, dark, confusing. It's a unique kind of pain. And I just think there's so many people. Sometimes you walk around, you just feel the sense of despair that is in people's lives and hearts right now. We are in an age of disillusionment and disenchantment. Well, that's what I want to talk about today, because one of my passionate convictions is that one of the great tools we have, not the only tool, but one of the great tools we have to help people who are experiencing those feelings and help our own hearts when we're feeling it, is beauty. I know that beauty may not seem like the most powerful tool for the apologist, but I actually am going to argue this is an ancient classical way of doing apologetics that has particular purchase and relevance right now in the current cultural moment. So here's what I want to do this morning. Two things really quickly. First, let's ask, why is beauty important in apologetics? That'll be our method. Then let's look through 5 specific ways that appeals to beauty can direct people toward God. So that'll be like case studies. So we'll talk about the method, then we'll do some case studies. And my personal prayer for our time is that not only might this equip us in our apologetics efforts and in our evangelism, but that it would even be nourishing to our own hearts. Because apologetics is not just for people out there, it's for our own hearts as a source of nourishment every day. Okay, first, why is beauty important in apologetics? Now, I'm going to start with a quotation from the Lord of the Rings. My congregation at home makes fun of me for constantly quoting the Lord of the Rings. So when I'm away, it's like, guilt-free quotations of the Lord of the Rings. I can quote it as much as you, and I will be referencing it multiple times. But sometimes there's just nothing else that quite captures the emotions of this story. I won't give away any too much detail, but one of the characters wakes up from a sleep. He suffered tremendously. He's greeted by an old friend whom he thought was dead, and he realizes, my friend is alive. And this is what it says. It says, the joy that fills him is so powerful that for a moment he's unable to speak. And then they both break into laughter. And it says, like, the laughter was like water on a parched land, and it fell upon his ears like the echo of all the joys he had ever known. I love that line. That's, to me, like the first 15 seconds of heaven. The echo of every joy you've ever known. And then he says, I feel like spring after winter and sun on the leaves, and like trumpets and harps and all the songs I have ever heard. Is everything sad going to come untrue? We've probably heard that quote, everything sad is going to come untrue. But boy, it helps to reposition our hearts to contemplate that afresh regularly. This is a great picture of how the gospel should make us feel, the affective impact of the Christian gospel on the human heart. The word gospel means good news. The gospel is the message that the creator of our universe has come in the person of Jesus Christ to draw us back to himself, to restore all things to the way that they should be. And the first installment of that has already happened in the resurrection of Christ. And if that message is true, it does mean that every sad thing is going to come untrue. So let's suppose that you're a naturalist and you believe that there's nothing beyond physical nature and you're living your life in this mode. And then you start to, your friend gives you a copy of Paul Gould or Paul Copan's book, and they're starting to read this, and you're saying, maybe there's something to this after all. The Holy Spirit starts working on you. You go through a long process, and then you come to that moment in the process, especially the pre-conversion process, when your defenses are being reduced, and you start to wonder, maybe it's true. What does that feel like to enter from this place to now contemplating? And to me, I like to use images like this. It feels like when Lucy opens the wardrobe and walks into Narnia. Here's another metaphor I use in my book. By the way, my book is back there. It looks like this. It's the purple one. If it's of interest to you, it's called Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. Hopefully it could be of use or help to someone out there. It's basically in this vein of thinking about beauty. Here's a metaphor I use in the book. Imagine that you've been trapped in the basement of a house all your life. You've never heard that there are such things as trees, waterfalls, or the blue sky. And then all of a sudden, one day, you crash through one of the walls and you see there's a stairway leading up into who knows what, and you see sunlight creaking through the little slit at the bottom of the doorway, and you think, who knows what could be up there? That's what it feels like to go from naturalism to theism. Who knows what could be out there? You've just expanded your metaphysics and the emotional implications of your metaphysics literally infinitely. Here's two other images I like to use. If you go from naturalism to considering that maybe the gospel is true, it feels like when you wake up in the morning and you're an 8-year-old kid, this one is from my own upbringing. I don't know if this will communicate to anybody else. And you think, oh, I have to go to school. What day is it? What do I do? And then it hits you that it's Christmas morning. Does anyone else remember this feeling? You wake up and you're like, oh, what day? Oh, it's Christmas, that great feeling. It's like this awakening of joy, this crescendo of joy. Or here's another one. I know it feels good to even think about joy. It makes you joyful even thinking about it. Here's my last one. When you're pursuing the person that you love most in all this world, and that moment comes when you realize, she loves me too. How does that feel? The gospel is like all of that rolled up and expanded even more, because the gospel is this enchanting, enthralling story. The gospel is the stuff of infinite glory and life forevermore. You know you've gotten a whiff of the gospel if this thought comes into your mind. Can it really be that good? Well, what I want to put forward for us and try to press into our hearts and imaginations a little bit more is that I think in the task of apologetics, in light of all the pain out there, it really helps right now to press that into people's hearts. It really helps to press the affective implications of the gospel right now. It really helps to situate people so as to experience the gospel not merely as true, though it is that, but also as good and beautiful. And as it comes down to it, this is actually a classic Christian approach. The ancient philosophers spoke of the three transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? And Christians have historically put an enormous amount of reflection into how important it is to commend the gospel as not just the true, but also the good and the beautiful. I'll just read a quote. It's not in my notes here, but it's from the great Roman Catholic theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's probably the greatest theologian in all church history of beauty. Here's what he says. This is from page 5, if you pick it up. In a world that no longer has confidence in itself to affirm the beautiful, the proofs of the truth have lost their cogency. In other words, syllogisms may still dutifully clatter away like rotary presses or computers which infallibly spew out an exact number of answers by the minute, but the logic of these answers is itself a mechanism which no longer captivates anyone. I like that verb, captivates, because the gospel must not merely convince, it must captivate. There's many others who've thought along these lines. Blaise Pascal is my favorite one. I love Blaise Pascal. I read through the Pensée very carefully in preparation for my book, Peter Kreeft's edition, revised edition. It's so good. There's so much to it, and here's just one way of getting at it. What Pascal is saying is we have to be strategic about the way we commend the gospel to people. By religion, he means Christianity, and he says, men despise religion, they hate it and fear it is true. To remedy this, we must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason, that it is venerable, to inspire respect for it. Then we must make it lovable, to make good men hope it is true. Finally, we must prove it is true. Now, here's my great burden. He's got a threefold strategy there. He says, first, make it respectable. That's really important. You have to at least get a foot in the door to say, this is worth having a conversation about. Second, he says, make it desirable, make good men wish it were true, then prove that it is true. And my burden is that so much of apologetics seems to start with step 3. And what I think is shrewd about Pascal is the psychological wisdom to say, you can't just start by hammering away with arguments. Okay, if you think that will work in apologetics, just think about how it works if you get into an argument with your spouse. Is this an effective way of remedying an argument, or with anybody? You just start with logic? You just hurl logic at them? Well, usually that's not as effective, and the reason is logic is only one piece of the pie for what actually changes real people and real decisions, because a lot of times we have our defenses up. In any act of communication, we have to consider not merely what to say, but how to say it, what order to say it in, how we can reduce, and Jesus is a great model of this in the way he interacts with people in the Gospels. Now, this is an ancient strategy, appealing to the good, the true, the beautiful, but I believe for 3 reasons I want to share with you, it is especially relevant right now If you can believe this, we're almost into November 2022. It's weird to even say that out loud because that feels like some futuristic year or month out there. Soon we'll be into 2023. But right now, it seems that there's a particular need for beauty. Why is that? 3 reasons. Number 1, right now we live in a time of disillusionment and disenchantment. I believe our greatest enemy as apologists is usually not a really sharp counter-argument. Usually it is apathy. It is more common for you to have an experience when you're trying to talk about God with someone that they just sort of, they're not tracking with you because they're thinking about something else, than that they have this razor-sharp, nuanced answer to the Kalam cosmological argument. Those exist, but they're less commonly at play in your actual conversations than the sheer wall of apathy to spiritual things, seems to me. Charles Taylor talks a lot about the immanent frame, and we're all, so often transcendence just feels too remote from people. Now, I believe that beauty is a powerful tool for cutting through apathy and reaching to the heart. I have known many people who have become a Christian in large measure through reading fiction like The Lord of the Rings. Now, you think about that. Why would reading a fiction story cause someone to become a Christian? Well, one of the reasons I wonder is because there is such a sense of glory that is communicated through the story that is hard to make sense of within the confines of a naturalistic worldview. And I've heard people talk about this. They're reading The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien will go on for like 17 pages about this particular forest, And you're reading, you're like, okay. But then, at a certain point, he says something, and it's like, whoa. There's something big here. And I don't really know how to come to terms with that within this flat worldview that I'm currently operating in. Beauty can speak through the disenchantment. I was once talking with an apologist who was saying that he gave 2 sets of lectures. And the first, how sometimes if you're ever public speaking, you realize prayer is the biggest tool you have, because sometimes you can prepare all you want and it completely falls flat. Other times it goes well and you never know why, what's the difference. There's lots of factors. He said the first night everything fell flat, even though he thought he had good arguments, and he was giving arguments for God. He said the second night he came back and he spoke much more simply about the absurdity of human existence apart from God. And all this wall of hostility he faced the first night just melted away. I think getting through to the emotional and existential implications of the gospel is one way to cut through the disenchantment and flatness of our worldview. Secondly, so that's one reason we need beauty, disenchantment. Second reason is distraction. Oh man, one of our big barriers to doing apologetics today is this. We are just, as a culture, more than any other time in human history, bombarded with information and noise and entertainment that dulls us to the matters of the soul. And it's really hard to just get into a conversation about something deep. Pascal also said the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. Have you ever heard this quote? And when I first heard Pascal say the sole cause of our unhappiness is we can't stay quietly in our room, I thought he was just making an overstatement for rhetorical effect about the importance of solitude or something like this, But then I thought about it and I read it in context and I realized what he's actually saying is we were meant for eternity. We have a deep restlessness inside our heart as a result of that. And the thing we do, because we can't fill the restlessness, is divert our attention from it. We fill our lives with distractions in order to avoid the ultimate questions of human existence, such as meaning and death. And this is a great tool for distraction and diversion. Well, I believe that beauty is a tool we have to try to cut through the distraction, just like it can cut through the apathy. Beauty gets our attention, and it helps us slow down and really consider. Peter Kreeft I keep hearing people pronounce it Peter Kreeft, so I'm going to assume I'm wrong. Peter Kreeft always speaks of beauty as goodness' prophet. I love that image. Think of the good, the true, and the beautiful walking down the road, and beauty goes first with a trumpet, saying, "Here we come," Beauty leads the way and calls attention to the good and the beautiful. Now, I live out in Ojai, California, which is about 80 miles northwest of LA, more rural area, so there's not a lot of lights. And there's also, because it's Southern California, not a lot of clouds. And we also just bought a trampoline for our 5 kids that I'm excited to get back to tonight and see. And one of the things that I have started doing, because I'm trying to spend less time trying to practice what I preach with my phone here, is I'll go up and I'll lie on the trampoline and look at the stars before I go to sleep at night. A simple activity like this is really helpful and nourishing. Slow down, reflect, but also just the absolute beauty of nature is one tool to cut through the constant barrage of distraction and induce the human heart to consider questions of transcendence and ultimacy. And there are times gazing up into the seemingly infinite abyss of beauty and wonder that is our universe, listening to the wind blow through the trees. This longing comes over my heart that I cannot possibly put into words. But how many people never experience that because they're too busy and they live in a city where they can't see the stars and they're too busy and they never have those quiet moments in nature? That's a problem in our culture. Beauty can help us. Okay, I'm going to start going faster. Third reason we need beauty is because we live in a time of outrage. Couldn't think of a D word. Disenchantment, distraction. I don't know. Help me out. Think about that one. Outrage is all I could think of. You feel this as well when I'm riding an Uber and by the end of it, my driver is wanting to, hammer away at me about some political thing. It's 2022, right? It's like these are the times we live in. The culture wars, the anger, the hostility, the tribalism, all that is so real in our culture right now. And whatever else you say about that, we can't deny it has a huge impact upon our efforts to commend the gospel. A Christian apologist I know shared with me that he used to get questions from university students 20 years ago more about the truthfulness of Christianity, like, did Jesus rise from the dead? Does God exist? Today he gets very different questions. So many of them are about whether the church is intolerant or not. I think this is broadly representative of our whole culture, and the simple point is if we're only hammering away at truth, then we're actually missing many of the central animating concerns of our culture, because our culture is deeply, deeply concerned about goodness and beauty. So here's what we'll do, and I'll go lightning fast. Let's work through 5 examples of features in our world. Let's look at them first through Christian theism and then through naturalism and see the differing implications for the gospel. The wager I make is that Christianity provides not just a more intellectually compelling framework, but a more emotionally and intuitively satisfying one. Another way to say it is Christianity is not just the more plausible story, it's just a flat-out better story. Christianity is just way more interesting than naturalism. And it's so much more beautiful that one way you can put it is if you stare at any one of these 5 features I'm about to mention for long enough, it will make a puddle glum out of any of us. Does anyone know who Puddle Glum is? What book is Puddle Glum from? Silverchair. Okay, this is an apologetics crowd. You don't need me to even explain this probably, right? They're underground, they're enchanted, they're being told by the sorceress there's no overworld. Puddle Glum basically says, I'm setting out to look for Aslan anyway. In his letters, C.S. Lewis describes this as what he calls an ontological argument. Really interesting comment. In my book, I talk a lot about that. Think of each of these as like a Pascalian wager trying to make a puddle glum out of each of us. Number 1, justice. We already mentioned how much outrage there is in our culture right now. We disagree as a culture on what is injustice, but nobody needs to be convinced that injustice is bad and justice is good, and we should care about it. One of the ways you see this is in movies. One of the things that I observed several years ago that just kind of hit me, it's kind of like when you finally see something that's really obvious, is that every single movie you ever watch follows the same structure. Good and evil clash, good gets beat up for a while, and then eventually good wins. And there's this kind of resolution and this good, happy feeling that comes over you at the end of a good movie. Not every single movie. I talk about exceptions in my book, but even the exceptions, curiously, direct our hearts and minds to the same basic principle. Infinite different forms. Sometimes it's Rocky Balboa losing to the Russian, but there's always the same thing. Good and evil, good loses, finally good wins. One of the questions that comes up is, why is that? Why do we tell stories that have the same basic moral framework? And there's basically 2 different ways of looking at it. From a naturalistic perspective, you would talk about it from evolutionary psychology. And on this worldview, it's really hard to see that there is any ultimate objective basis for those moral intuitions, our sense that justice is significant and our longing for a final resolution to justice. Now, there are people today, I have a lot to say about this, I'll just summarize it. There are people today like Sam Harris who will try to find some kind of objective ground for morality, but honestly, that is more of the exception within the history of atheism. Most historic atheists are better represented by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche said there are no moral facts whatsoever. Nietzsche said morality is as much a deception as religion. And he's got the famous passage many of you have heard quoted over and over where he's basically, the prophet is proclaiming the death of God, and the metaphors that he uses are basically the loss of God is like wiping away the horizon or unchaining the earth from the sun. And at one point he simply asks, is there still any up or down? So you can set up the contrast between new atheists like Harris, even though they're still not that new, but still newer, and this older instinct among atheists like Nietzsche, and you could ask, well, which one is right? And the fact is that the old atheists, in my opinion, are far more rigorous and thoroughgoing with their own worldview, because if you try to explain the longing for justice in the human heart on the basis of evolutionary psychology, two things follow. I'll give you the cliff notes. I go into more of this in the book. Number one, that longing is an illusion. When you see someone mistreated and that moral indignation rises up in your heart, or when you're watching your favorite movie and you long for the good guys to win, this is essentially our brain tricking us. Those feelings are just there because they played a role in helping our animal ancestors survive and pass on their genes. Any feeling of ultimate significance or transcendence associated with those feelings is an illusion. Second, in such a worldview, morality is also arbitrary. If the evolutionary process had gone differently, as it extremely easily could have, we could have developed a completely different set of moral intuitions. Here's how Charles Darwin himself put it in a famous passage. He says, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be any doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would even think of interfering. Now, these are called Darwinian counterfactuals. They're really gross. So I will spare you from any others. But suffice to say, all you have to do is look at how the insect world evolved and use your imagination, and you can start to see, oh yeah, if evolution is the sum total explanation, a reductive account, which is not to say if it had a role in the process, but if it's the reductive explanation, you get to a point where you have nothing outside that process by which to pass judgment on which direction it goes. And that leaves you with an arbitrary morality. And if you think about what that means, it will make a puddle glum out of you because it's pretty dark. Okay, consider the opposite. What about in Christian theism? In Christian theism, the conscience is not a deception. It's just the opposite. It's a little clue. It's a little window into ultimate reality, into what is more real than space and time. It's rooted in the fact that we're made in the image of a just God. And our longing for justice is an awareness of the story we are a part of. J.R.R. Tolkien talked a lot about this with this idea of sub-creation. He's basically saying, because we're made in God's image, we tell stories that are patterned after the true story, the world we live in. That means that not only is our conscience not a deception but a clue, it means our longing for final moral resolution. The longing that you feel at the end of the movie when it feels like, the world is now right again. That is a clue of what one day will really happen everywhere. If Christian theism is true, there will be perfect justice one day. Every wrong will be righted, every score will be settled, and everything sad will become untrue. That feeling at the end of your favorite movie is not an illusion, but it's a clue. Think about that long enough, stare at that long enough, really think through at a personal level, it'll make a puddle glum out of each of us. Okay, here's another one, love. Now let me start, in the book I confess how much I love the music of Frozen 2. And my defense is that I have young children, but I'll be honest, I would like it anyway. So I can admit that. These songs are pretty interesting, actually. Sometimes kids' movies get you into some deep philosophy, and there's one song called Do the Next Right Thing. I won't sing it, don't worry, which is sung by the character Anna after her friend Olaf dies. Olaf is the snowman. And basically, I mean, it's pretty deep and it's pretty dark, actually. You can look up the lyrics on your phone. The theme, so the film is exploring themes of permanence and transience. And in this song, Olaf says, "Hey, Anna, I just thought of one thing that is permanent." And she says, "What's that?" And he says, "Love." And then they hug. She says, "I love you," and Olaf melts away. Now, this may be the most common sentiment in all the arts. I will love you forever. Love is forever. If you stop and think about it, that's a fascinating and controversial philosophical idea. Is love forever? If you take a look at this from their paradigm, naturalism, Christian theism, you start to run into the same kind of dynamics that want to make you feel like puddleglum. Like, even if naturalism is true, I hate it and I want to run the other direction. And that doesn't mean that it isn't true, but it's at least a factor that needs to be accounted for on some level, and at least it makes you pay attention, you know? In a naturalistic worldview, love is not permanent. The feeling of love is reduced to biology. It has a similar function as to the conscience. It came about as a byproduct, or what people call a spandrel, a spin-off of the evolutionary process. It affects us the way it does because it helped our animal ancestors survive. In a way, it's kind of an accident. It feels like it has transcendent significance, but that's just tricking our brains. That's just because that feeling helped our animal ancestors pass on their genes. And this is why you can find atheists like Richard Dawkins saying that falling in love is irrational. Now, the point is here, by the way, just to make a really quick clarification that's very important, the idea here is not that if you're a naturalist, you will be less loving or less just. That is not the point. The point is there's no objective basis outside of our biology for that reality. Okay, consider the opposite. In Christianity, love is the very core of reality. Love is shared among the members of the Godhead. There never was a time when love was not. The Bible even says God is love. The reason for the creation of our universe was an overflow of love, a supreme act of generosity, God wanting to share his glory with creatures. And in that view, there's every reason to affirm Olaf's statement that love is permanent in an exactly literal sense. You could sum up the differences as I put them up here on the slide. I won't run through all of this, but suffice to say, it's a pretty pungent difference. One philosopher sums it up by saying like this: in naturalism, death is stronger than love. In Christianity, love is stronger than death. Here's a way to do the puddleglum experiment, is to just ask, which of those worldviews can you actually live with if you really think about it while you're holding your child in your arms? Okay, I'm going to go fast. I don't want you to get bored. Math. Math is beautiful. I would not have thought so when I was growing up because math was not my favorite subject in school. However, subsequently studying the philosophy of math, I have started to become convinced that, number one, it is very beautiful and it is also very mysterious. And from a naturalistic worldview, it's very hard to make sense of. In the book, I talk about 3 features of math that are difficult to account for, not necessarily impossible, in a naturalistic worldview. Its permanence, its beauty, and its usefulness. Just real quick, on its permanence, one way you can get at this is to ask, if this entire physical universe were to collapse into non-being, would it still be true that 2 + 3 = 5? Not everyone has the same answer to that. But most working mathematicians, about 65%, and almost all of the ordinary non-mathematicians among us, like me, say, of course. What else could 2 + 3 ever equal other than 5? And not only does it seem to always equal 5, but it seems to equal exactly 5. 10 billion years from now, it won't ever start equaling 4.99999. It seems to have this hard-edged exactitude. And the question is, if physical reality is all there is in a naturalistic worldview, where does it get that durability? Math seems to be a realm of eternal and necessary truths. Truths that must obtain for and always obtain in every possible world. I like to think of math, when I was studying this, the metaphor I thought of is, think of like an invisible castle rising up all around us that you can access through thinking. The question is, where does it come from? What convinced me that a good appeal could be made here is reading the philosophers of math. And oh, the metaphors they use to describe what mathematical discovery feels like and why it is so exciting. One is saying that math is like entering into a different realm. He calls it an ice palace. That you go from this coarse, variegated world of concrete objects into this ice palace of perfect abstract truths. Another calls it reading a book that someone else has already written. Every new mathematical discovery, we turn a page and see something else that someone, because it's like, another uses the metaphor saying doing math is like being an archaeologist rather than an architect. You're not building, you're discovering real binding truth that two different people in completely different contexts could both arrive upon. And so the question that kind of comes up is, where does it get this permanence? Where does it seems mysterious. Now the other question is, why does it work so well on physical reality? Why do ideas and objects map together like two puzzle pieces? Why does the realm of math apply to our physical universe so exactly? And that's where you can see the famous quote from Eugene Wigner, and I won't even get into that side of it. You can read the book for that case. But suffice to say, to try to move quickly here, that's where you're looking from a naturalistic worldview at math, and it's very mysterious. If you're looking from the perspective of Christian theism at math, it is as unsurprising as finding books in a library or food in a pantry. That there would be eternal and necessary truths is something you might expect even if you believe in an eternal and necessary mind. And there's various ways you can construe that, but you've got some options for how to make sense of it. And just, it's kind of a happy thought actually for those of us who are more on the nerdy side. Whenever you're learning, you're thinking God's thoughts after him. Pretty cool. All right, number 4, music. Probably all of us have had experiences where music seems to convey a sense of transcendence, something we can hardly put into words. Now, I watch a lot of debates between theists and atheists. The argument that's surprising to me most frequently merits an acknowledgement from the unbelieving side, the skeptical side, would be aesthetic arguments, such as arguments from music. Albert Einstein once told a famous young violin prodigy after hearing him play, "Now I know there is a God in heaven." Steve Jobs, after hearing Yo-Yo Ma play Bach while visiting his house, teared up and said, "That's the best argument for God I've ever heard of." You can see that quote on the screen. There's all kinds of anecdotes like this. And the question is, why does music evoke that sense of transcendence? Now, I do not like triumphalist apologetics, and so I was really skeptical that a good argument could ever be made from music. I went into it kicking and screaming. What won me over is reading the top philosophers of music. For the last 200 years, in the conversations happening in the philosophy of music, what they're all wrestling with is, where does music get its power of meaning? What everyone recognizes is music has an ability to convey meaning, concrete, aesthetic meaning. Music can make you feel happy or sad, but music doesn't communicate meaning in a representational way like words do. And so there's different schools of thought, but what everyone's puzzling about and what everyone recognizes is music can convey meaning. The question is, they're trying to figure out, how does it do that? Ultimately, in a naturalistic worldview, to look from that angle, this transcendent power of music and its ability to convey meaning is again explained as the unintentional byproduct of our evolutionary history. Basically, we evolved to recognize, pattern recognition has survival value. Music has patterns, so our brains subconsciously get a dopamine hit while we're listening to music. That's one theory. There's all kinds of theories like this. From a Christian perspective, music and our longing is just like our longing for justice. It is a little clue about what is out there. Peter Kraft, you know how it is when you say, now you can't remember which is the right one, which is the wrong one, but I think I got it that time. Calls music the original language. Oh, I love that. The original language, the first language. Before there was English or any other language, there was music. This is a Christian tradition of thought rooted in the book of Job, where in Job 38:7, the morning stars are singing at creation, and you see this in the Silmarillion, where Tolkien is portraying the world's creation as essentially a work of music. The music goes out, the harmony goes out and creates physical reality. See the exact same thing in The Magician's Nephew. Aslan sings the world into being. All the stars join in while he's singing. So here's the contrast. For naturalism, music, the transcendent power of music is an illusion, distracting you from reality. For Christianity, it's a clue. It's the original language whispering to you of what's really out there. Here's a metaphor. I've got about 3 more minutes. Is that okay? Okay. Want to get to the last one, which is hope. But here, can I give you a metaphor? So in a naturalistic worldview, music is like an opiate to a dying person. You love music because it distracts you from what reality is really like. It gives you something to focus on rather than what's really around you, because music is pleasant and beautiful and orderly, but reality is ultimately very chaotic. And so we like music because it pulls us away from what things are like, an opiate to a dying person. In a theistic worldview, music is like a window to an imprisoned man. It's pleasant insofar as it's a portal or window toward reality. It gives you a little glimmer of what might be out there. It's one avenue by which transcendence comes down to touch and grace our lives. So here's the metaphor. Imagine a man stuck in a prison cell, and he's never been outside, but he has a window in the prison cell. And he can look out the window and occasionally see clouds or birds, and he can hear things. And he's wondering, what else is out there? If Christian theism is true, music is like that window. It's a little clue, and that's why it makes you feel the way you do. It's not tricking you. Though that question of what else is out there is a valid question. All right, lastly, hope. Hope is essential to human life. Psychologists talk a lot about this. When you're struggling with depression, one of the things you have to focus on is meaning and hope. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." In the movie The Shawshank Redemption, there's a character named Andy who is trying to find hope in a seemingly hopeless situation, and he faces the basic choice, get busy living or get busy dying. I always think, if the movie's over 20 years old, I can quote it and not worry about spoiling it for you. He chooses to live, and in the context of the choice, he makes a very interesting statement. Listen to movies, and you'll get a lot of philosophy. He says, hope is a good thing, maybe the best thing, and no good thing ever dies. Can a naturalist agree with Andy Dufresne? Does hope never die? I can't see how, because if you just wait long enough, there will be nothing and no one to do any hoping. Every individual person will die, and the entire universe will eventually wind down, however you want to phrase that, and every single achievement of every single person and all of human beings collectively eventually will be forgotten. There's no hope there. Imagine you're in the hospital with your friend and they have 1 hour to live, and you're a naturalist. Imagine they have 5 minutes to live. What can you even say? There's no hope. If Christianity is true, we don't just have a hope, we have the best hope imaginable. The resurrection of Jesus, which reverses suffering and death and turns it back to glory. And amazingly, if we're united to Jesus, that will be true for every single one of us at the most vivid personal level. Everything sad will come untrue, not in a generic, big way, but for you in your personal tragedies. Tim Keller puts it like this: resurrection means every horrible thing that has ever happened will not only be undone and repaired, but will in some way make the eventual glory and joy even greater. So here's a thought experiment to end with, okay? If you want to close your eyes for this, you can, but just think about this with me. Imagine one of the happier moments of your life. Sometimes it can be like a big childhood event like your wedding day, but sometimes it's just a calm, just something happy, something where you truly felt happy. Maybe as a child when the world was safe and calm, maybe being truly loved by another person when you expected to be rejected, maybe in the accomplishment of a dream, maybe in reconciliation with a friend, maybe in a simple moment of contentment out in nature, whatever it might be. Now suppose, just for the sake of argument, that you knew in your deepest heart of hearts that you would have that feeling of happiness back permanently, and that it was actually only ever an anticipation or foreshadowing of a final, settled happiness that you will experience forever with ever-increasing awareness and enjoyment. In other words, imagine that your happy moments are not gone from you once they are over, but they will return to you in some deeper and yet all familiar form. Now think of the suffering in your life, and imagine that in heaven, God will somehow bring healing to it such that he will bend it around to serve your greater glory and joy. Can you see the difference between these two worldviews when it comes to hope? It's either the difference of nothing of permanent or transcendent hope or the best hope imaginable. And for those of us who have placed our faith in Jesus Christ, that hope is ours. And it helps to nourish our own hearts with that, and it gives us something very wonderful to offer to our friends who might be feeling like C.S. Lewis, but after we get the gospel to them, maybe they'll feel a little better. Thank you.